Okay. I was remembering a an acquaintance, a hippie, homeless kind of guy who was doing qigong with the Chinese immigrant community at the university. I was the only other um, gringo with the Chinese community. I was a student at the university, and he was not a student, but he nobody complained about him joining in. And I would see him at the local, anarchist hippie cafe restaurant, and so then we also took the bus together after class. There was a shuttle because the class was we would meet in the other city in St. Paul because this was in Twin Cities, University of Minnesota. So we're talking almost 30 years ago, 1997, 1998. And he asked me he was complaining to me how he didn't feel anything when he meditated. And I immediately replied that Yan Shin, Qigong Master Yan Shin, said you should not rely on your feelings when you meditate, that the chi is beyond feelings. And so he didn't want to hear this because when we meditate, we want to depend on our observations, our feelings, our perceptions, um, and those are nice things to depend on. So if we were to depend on our feelings, what would chi feel like? And there's a good book on this by Montauk Chia. Um, I was talking with a neighbor recently, and they mentioned Thailand. Hello, and Montauk Chia teaches out of Thailand, so they were talking about somebody doing qigong or tai chi or something from Thailand, and I thought, well, they probably studied with Montauk Chia. But he has a good introduction book. I think it's called like Awakening Healing Energy. Of the Tao, something like that. I read that again like almost 30 years ago, and that goes through the different energy centers and what a person would feel or perceive when they start to meditate. But essentially, when you realize when you as I meditated, I had these experiences, and then I studied science to kind of reverse engineer what I experienced. And so why would somebody feel chi when they meditate? And so you learn that basically our brain is 2/3 of our brain relies on vision for the energy. So our brain is about 25 watts of energy. This is all from science, and so that's about 2/3 of 25 is about 17 watts. Um, for That's used just for vision. So that's quite a bit of energy right there. But then you learn that the body is filled with biophotons, and biophotons are coherent laser energy. And so that's something you experience. Like when I first took in the level 2 class, the Qigong master, he said he could detect energy blockages in a person's organ. He could tell us what percentage your organ was working. So I went up to him and I said I'd felt some heat in my right kidney, and he looked at when he looked at at my right kidney from the front of my body, I instantly felt this like laser bliss, this heat just on my right kidney. And so on the biophotons, the laser energy from a Qigong master is essentially like this biophoton energy that's concentrated in the body. So then you realize, well, when you have your eyes open, the science has proven that the biophotons are actually leaving out of your eyes. And so when you meditate with your eyes closed, you're actually accumulating those biophotons that otherwise as energy that otherwise would be leaving. So in qigong, it's called a gong. A gong is 100 days, but they um they sort of compare it with gestation in the womb. So then they have the next period is 90 days, or nine months, or so it's 3 months for the gong, like a trimester. And um and so the idea is you have to have celibacy. That's just the traditional teaching of qigong, and it's just like in Indian yoga, you're required to have celibacy of not just the body but also the mind. And that's what the storing up the biophotons is, because in terms of religion, with our eyes open, then obviously we're attracted, or we have reactions to beautiful form that we see. So that's why qigong masters are so rare, because if you don't have that purification, then you don't store up the energy. So maybe that's why this guy wasn't feeling anything. I don't know. I couldn't, like, um change his private life. I don't know about that. Another good book about this is Tao and Longevity, I think it's called, by Master Nan Watson. So basically, at first you feel a lot of heat in the knees, and then you'll feel heat. For this, I'm talking from personal experience. I felt a lot of heat then in the thyroid, and then I felt the heat in the center of the brain. So if you think about it as a male, every time a male has a reproduction reaction, we'll call it, there's 100 million um, reproductive cells that fly out of the body. But the question is what powers that flight? And obviously, it's a strong reaction of energy. And so when you have celibacy, that's another part of the energy that you're storing up. And what you're really storing up is the nervous system that powers that reaction. And so for males in science, we learned that that's triggered by a sympathetic nervous system reaction. So at first, that's what causes the very initial reaction, is the sympathetic nervous system when you see something through so that turns out to be a biophoton signal that pre-triggers that reaction. So then when you do standing exercises, what you're doing is you're reversing that trigger, as what they call a parasympathetic rebound. So you have to use the power of your legs to cause a shaking that then causes an extreme sympathetic reaction that then causes a reversal as a what they call parasympathetic rebound. So then you meditate after the standing exercises. And so when you meditate, you'll feel this heat and this bliss. And so what that is the vagus nerve being activated, and the heat is created from this vagus nerve increase, the right side vagus nerve that goes down to the reproductive organs. And then as that builds up, so you're literally, my point is here is the thyroid gets hot because you're reversing your neural hormones that you normally would be losing. from reproduction. So when a person goes through puberty, the reproductive glands get a lot bigger, and then thymus the thymus gets a lot smaller. So I think it's was it my thymus? It might have been my thymus that got hot, not my thyroid. I'm trying to remember. I've been saying thyroid, but I think it was actually my thymus that got hot. Anyway, and then of course the pineal gland gets really hot because you're making the pineal gland bigger because the whole like your pineal gland, it receives the third highest amount of blood of any organ in the body. So all the blood is bypasses the blood brain barrier, and then it gets converted into cerebral spinal fluid in the blood does through the pineal gland. And so when you meditate, you are increasing the cerebral spinal fluid through the celibacy also. And that's what the yang qi is. Yang qi is based on ionization of that cerebral spinal fluid through the lecithin. So for a male, the primary ingredient of your reproductive cells is actually lecithin. And that's what myelinates the neurons. So that that the lecithin gets turned into the myelination, and that's what stores up the charge. So when you have your eyes closed, the yin qi feels like a tingling, an internal tingling, because it's the negative ions, and then the yang qi is the positive ions, and that would be the delocalized protons. So as you meditate more, the yang qi then turns into what's called kundalini, um, or Shakti, and then it becomes Shakti, which is the Wan Chi. And so the Wan Chi is after you build up the Yin Chi enough, and then with celibacy, activate the Yang Chi, which then activates the Wan Chi. So the Wan Chi feels like a really, really, really strong magnetic field. And you have this strong magnetic field, but it's also an anti-gravitational force. So it's also like levitational, and you'll feel it actually like pull your body up, away, is anti-gravitational. And that's where you start having precognitive visions that are more real than being awake, and you can see ghosts. I've had all these experiences and telekinesis and telepathy out of the center of the skull, like an energy field. It's like a electromagnetic field. And then you start having some other wild experiences. But that's pretty much it. And so I have a list of energy videos, and there's one of the examples is pyrokinesis. But when you really build up this energy as a laser energy, you can use it to start fires. And so, like, some teachers, they start fires with their eyes or their hands. They can send out this laser energy out of their hands, and that's what the Shakti is, or that's the Shen in Taoism. It's called Shen as spirit, but um, and so then eventually you can create new matter from that energy through meditation, and that's what the bilocation is. It's called the Yang Shen. So internally you see blue light, but then externally it's seen as golden light. And so that's like the most advanced level of meditation, is creating new matter as bilocation, um, and doing that for other people. So the some of the medical qigong healing stories that Chun Yilin shares is that where he actually created new matter in other people's bodies, like somebody had internal bleeding, and he went to the hospital and he created a sac that contained the blood in their body, and when they opened the person up in surgery, they found this sac that had been stopped the internal bleeding. So I'll leave it with that final story. And Chen Yulin, he's been tested. Yeah, Thanks for listening. He's been tested by the Mayo Clinic doctors, so you can look up his. There was a study by Ann Vincent. Dr. Ann Vincent got published in peer-reviewed science journal. She's one of the Mayo Clinic doctors. Also, Dr. Nisha Manek, and Dr. There's a guy. Can't remember his name, but he's one of the co-authors with Ann Vincent in that study. Let's see if I can find it. Ann Vincent Journal G. There we go. His name is Brent Bauer. Brent Bauer. There was a video of him too, giving a little plug for Spring Forest Qigong. I don't know if it's still on their website or not. I should look for it. But and then Nisha Manek, she's on YouTube. She published a book about trying to explain Qigong, and she relies on symmetry, but I argue it's actually asymmetry. It's what science calls non-commutativity. And so that's my own take on it, and that I feel that also explains why Western science is destroying life on Earth as an ecological crisis. Of course, people don't want to hear that, so but it explains why Western science cannot explain the paranormal and spiritual phenomenon and stuff like that. But it also explains the ecological crisis. So a lot of people they might be interested in the paranormal, but they don't want to hear about how Western science is destroying life on Earth as the ecological crisis. For me, those two go hand in hand, and explains why there's no Western science usually just dismisses the paranormal as fake. And with good reason, because it also, because you have to have the celibacy, and the Western science is based on the commodity fetish, to sell, AKA sex sells, So I was just watching the Netflix. There's a new train wreck documentary about American Apparel. I watched that yesterday. That's a great example of this commodity fetish, sex sells, in Western culture. But you wouldn't like I used to watch Chinese soap operas from the they were from the 2000s, and they would always call people pervs. Yeah, they would call people pervs in the this what was this Rainy, what was her name? I think it was Rainy somebody. She was real famous in, I think it was Taiwan. And but they're they're like for teenagers or something. I don't know. You watch they're romantic comedies with me. I think they're musicals too, so I thought they were I I I just thought they were fun to watch because they're just like real drippy romance. And but what I found really fascinating about them is that they also were very what's the word? I can't even think of the word, but they're just like uh shy. I guess that's what I want to say. They're basically they would always, but yeah, they would. One of the main themes of these soap operas was calling people pervs, because if somebody was too uh they had too much lust, then they would just get outed as a perv right away. And so they were, even though they were romantic comedies, they would build up the romance very slowly, and that's what made them fun, because it would take like a whole series for like a whole year before they even kissed, and and that's what, to me, that's what romance is. Really, what makes it interesting is that the desire is something that enjoy. You don't have to. But at any rate, but those were pretty recent. This is my point. It's like in the 1980s in China, it was actually that women weren't not allowed to talk in public at first. They weren't allowed to initiate a conversation. Now that's like almost hard to believe, right? But that just gives you an idea of when the Qigong fever in China was going on in the 1980s. It was very much like a traditional, what we would call patriarchal culture, because in order to build up the chi energy, you have to have that strong like male bias or whatever, and you have to go beyond feelings, which is again what Yan Qin even said. I One of the Yan Qin Chinese students I talked to, he was considered the top student in Minnesota for qigong, and he told me, he's like, you just got to practice in secret, because I could feel the heat. I ran into him on the street in the university, and as I stood next to him, I could feel the heat coming out of him, and I'm thinking, wow, this guy's for real. I can feel the heat, and he's like, you just have to practice in secret. You can't tell anybody about it. So that's why, like the qigong master Chen Yilin, he gets up at like 3 a.m. and he does his serious meditation, in the morning. That's what I try to do too. Hey, cool. Okay. Yeah, I read it in paperback like in 1998, 1990s. Yeah, 1998. I think that's because I remember my friend's girlfriend at the time was reading it, and then she started taking qigong classes too. That's cool that you're reading that. That's a fun read. And they don't a lot of there was like criticism of that book, like, well, they don't believe it or whatever. But yeah, and Wang Li Ping, he supposedly walked through a wall. Okay, awesome. Great to hear. Yeah, according to David Verdesi, Wang Li Ping walked through a wall. Yeah, I believe it too. Because another good book, if you read Robert Peng, he describes how he had to do horse stance for nonstop for like 2 hours. And then finally, like all the pain went away, but at first it was just extreme pain. And then finally, like when the yang qi, when the wan qi gets activated, it held his body up, and there was no more pain. And it's like a strong, like electromagnetic, anti-gravitational force that is also really blissful in the body. Yeah, yeah. It's um, I've there's another. I read F.E.P. Chow's book. F.E.P. Chow. Her book is Miracle Healing from China. She was the first Qigong master I experienced in 1995, so that was 30 years ago. And I felt this really strong magnetic force pushing my hands apart. And then the class was just about ending, and I was there with my girlfriend at the time, and then the security guard came in the room and said, "I'm just wondering what's going on in here because a fuse got blown in the room behind you." And pretty much everybody was gone, and the security guard was like probably a student worker because it was a small private college, and they were a young lady, and um yeah, and yeah, I know. So I was totally hooked at that moment. I'm like, this is wild. Anyway, I'll see you later. Yeah.